spiritual life this morning, in your Christian life, that this morning you'll be able to reconnect, you'll be able to plug back in or break that circuit so that you can reconnect to the source of that power that's going to give you the victory in your spiritual life as you go through this life of faith. And so, as we read Mark chapter 9, verses 14 through 29, you'll notice that Jesus' own disciples are experiencing a failure of their faith, a power failure in their ministry. So Mark chapter 9, verse 14. When they came to the disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and scribes disputing with them. When the whole crowd saw him, they were amazed and ran to greet him. He asked them, "What are you arguing with them about?" Someone from the crowd answered him, "Teacher, I brought my son to you. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive it out, but they couldn't." He replied to them, "You unbelieving generation, how long will I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring him to me." So they brought the boy to him. When the spirit saw him, it immediately threw the boy into convulsions. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. "How long has this been happening to him?" Jesus asked his father. "From childhood," he said. "And many times it has thrown him into fire or water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us." Jesus said to him, "If you can, everything is possible for the one who believes." Immediately the father of the boy cried out, "I do believe. Help my unbelief." When Jesus saw that a crowd was quickly gathering, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, "You mute and deaf spirit, I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." Then it came out, shrieking and throwing him into terrible convulsions. The boy became like a corpse, so that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus, taking him by the hand, raised him, and he stood up. After he had gone into the house, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" And he told them, "This kind can come out by nothing but prayer." Our first point this morning is that a lack of faith results in fruitless ministry. A lack of faith results in fruitless ministry. I don't know if you've ever been in a ministry context. Maybe you've gone on a mission trip. Maybe you've just been serving at the church in a volunteer capacity, and you just feel like you're banging your head against the wall. Nothing is happening, and it just doesn't seem to be bearing any fruit. Well, I'm not suggesting it's your lack of faith or someone else's lack of faith, but a lack of faith can often result in fruitless ministry. And so we're going to diagnose the problem in these first 5 verses, 14 through 18. Remember, Jesus and Peter, James, and John had just come off of the mountaintop. Remember the mountain of glory, the glorious exaltation of Jesus that Peter, James, and John got to witness on top of that mountain. And so they're coming down off the mountain, and the other 9 disciples are down at the foot of the mountain. And apparently we see here that there's a crowd around them, and the scribes are arguing with them. And so here are the 9 that have been left. Jesus is away for a little bit, and now these 9 disciples are just trying to fend for themselves, trying to do as best they can what Jesus has told them to do. They're trying to continue the ministry and the work that they have been commissioned to do. And we'll see that in a minute. But the point is that right now, no ministry is happening. Okay, Jesus is up the mountain, so these other 9 disciples, they're kind of engaging, they're just spinning their wheels. There's nothing going on, and they're ineffective and unfruitful. They're unable to do the ministry that they are set out to do. So as you can read there, it says again in verse 14, when they came to the disciples, they saw this large crowd around them and scribes disputing with them. The main point of this point is a lack of faith results in fruitless ministry. But what we're going to see is that fruitless ministry, what does fruitless ministry look like in the context of a local church, in the life of a believer, and here with the 9 disciples that are left there? The first thing that I notice that's negative is that the scribes are or if he's directing that at the disciples. What are you arguing with the scribes about? But either way, they're all publicly there. So he's asking, what are you arguing about? Why are you arguing? They're disputing. And the point is that fruitless ministry, because there's this lack of faith, we'll talk more about faith in a minute, fruitless ministry is often characterized by disputes and arguments and criticism and rejection of the disciples, of the ministry. And there's this difference between a loving, faith-filled, faith-empowered ministry and a fruitless ministry that is characterized by disputes and arguments and criticism. And so there's this juxtaposition between Jesus' ministry of compassion and love, and this fruitless ministry that is characterized by a lack of faith and arguments and disputes. This is picked up by the Apostle Paul in Galatians 5, verse 14 to 15, where there's this juxtaposition between loving your neighbor and the disputes that can devour us. Galatians 5, verse 14 says, "For the whole law is fulfilled in one statement, love your neighbor as yourself. But if you bite and devour one another, watch out, or you will be consumed by one another." And so often fruitless ministry is characterized by this constant devouring of one another. Saying something about the pastor, saying something about the deacon, saying something about those non-members who are wrecking the place, or just having all of this anger and vehemence against each other. It's like a friendly fire where we're just firing on each other because we're just filled with this these disputes and these arguments. And so we see here the scribes, obviously they are religious leaders of Judaism, and they're not really buying what Jesus is offering, and so they reject that. They have already shown that they are against Jesus and his disciples, and so, but now the problem is they're dragging the disciples down into it. They're dragging the disciples down into the mud, and they're disputing with them. Jesus isn't there to answer for himself, so the disciples are trying the best they can to answer the critiques of the scribes, and they're getting nowhere. Now, we don't have the content of their argumentation, but when Jesus asks, "What are you arguing about?" the scribes don't answer. The disciples don't answer. I think the scribes don't answer because they are always shut down by Jesus. They don't really want to get into it with Jesus. The disciples probably don't answer because they're ashamed that they've gotten into these little petty disagreements and trying to stand their ground on their own. But instead, it says in verse 17, that someone from the crowd answered them. "Teacher, I brought my son to you. He has a spirit that makes him unable to speak. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him down, and he foams at the mouth, grinds his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive it out, but they couldn't." So we can begin to put pieces of the puzzle together and just determine that what had happened is this man, distraught and in need of help, has come, and the disciples couldn't help. And so the scribes are likely rejoicing in this and trying to build their case or build their argument. See, there's nothing here. This Jesus guy and these are his disciples. They can't do this. So you can imagine what that argument and that dispute might have been about. Obviously, the disciples would have, in that case, tried to defend themselves. But meanwhile, while they're disputing, another characteristic of fruitless ministry is revealed, and that is a lack of compassion. Fruitless ministry is marked by arguments and disputes, but also a lack of compassion. See, if we're too engaged in arguing with each other about petty details about how things should run or how things should go, then we're missing all of the people who are coming in and they're saying, "Help!" Right? I mean, there's a lack of compassion on our parts when we get dragged down into the disputes and the devouring watching that, and I'm over here suffering. I'm out here on the outskirts. I'm out here in the crowd going, who's caring about my case? Who's worried about what I'm going through? Because your disciples are over here spending too much time arguing. Now, there's a form of arguing that some of us value. We shouldn't call it